and it's talking about it. So that's what a human being is like. And that, to me, that's kind of an image of the mythological hero. It's the thing that can speak magic words and take the world apart. Now, in one of the stories I'm going to tell you today, which is the story of the Enuma Elish, which is the oldest written story that we have. It's a Mesopotamian story, and it's from the same pool of stories that the creation account in Genesis was extracted. It isn't obvious what the temporal sequence was, but imagine there was a pool of stories in the Middle East that were of indefinite age, tens of thousands of years, and each of them were developed in a slightly different way, although the themes underneath were similar. There are great parallels between the Mesopotamian creation account and the first part of the creation account in Genesis. So it was discovered in the late 1900s, and ISIS just destroyed a huge treasure trove of that sort of manuscripts. So just so you know, so at Nineveh, so we can thank the war in the Middle East for the destruction of a huge treasure house of irreplaceable human knowledge, and a lot of that's happening very, very frequently. It's an absolute bloody disgraceful catastrophe. So anyway, so you know, that's the human being: lips, tongues, hands, and the face. Your face is also extraordinarily amenable to voluntary manipulation. So you can learn to move single neurons in the tissue underneath your eyes. That's how high resolution your face is, and that's partly because it's a broadcast screen, which is why people are always looking at it, right? And that's why if you watch a movie, it's always concentrating on people's faces, is because they're just broadcasting what? They're broadcasting their stories constantly, and we're looking at their faces. What are you looking at? What are your eyes pointing at? What are you up to? What's your emotional expression? What are you going to do next? What do you think about me? Where are you going? And you're like, you find someone who has had too much plastic surgery uncanny, because their face is dead, because you cannot tell what they're up to. They've got this zombie-like aspect that's terrifying. And people like that, look, people like that got killed. That's why we're not like that, or they didn't mate. It's like, you want to know what that other person is up to. And I told you already, that's how the whites of our eyes evolved, right? Do you remember that story? Gorillas don't have that distinction between the iris and the whites, not like human beings. And our eyes are very sharp. And one thing we really want to know is, what are you looking at and why? What are you up to? And if I can tell what you're looking at, I can infer what you're going to do. And you want to broadcast that. Well, except when you don't want to broadcast it. But you know, most of the time you want to be pretty transparent to other people, because otherwise they won't trust you. And if they don't trust you, they won't cooperate with you. They won't compete with you. And the probability that they'll come after you is extraordinarily high, because you'll be evil predator in no time flat. So, okay. So, we'll take a look at the brain from another perspective. Now, a lot of this I got from Elkonin Goldberg. Well, that's not exactly right. I laid this out before that, but I found Elkonin Goldberg's writings afterwards, and he was a student of Luria's, and he was trying to account for why we had different hemispheres, roughly speaking, because it's not self-evident that we should. They're actually somewhat separate consciousnesses, and they communicate, but the communication isn't complete. It's like our brain is modularized and unified at the same time. And you can think about it like a meeting of people. Well, why do you want it modularized? Well, so if one person goes down, all of them don't. That's one reason. So it's some separation of function. Why else? Well, each little module can do its own creative thing independently of the others, and that's useful, and then there can be communication between them. And so there's utility in modularity, and there's utility in integration. And part of what we're trying to work out on the global political scene right now is how modular things should be and how integrated they should be. And the European community rushed into integration, and that's bothering people dreadfully, because they feel that the advantages of modularization have been washed away. You saw that, and maybe they're right, because you saw what happened when Greece collapsed, right? And Greece is very, very corrupt, incredibly corrupt. And Germany, whatever else you might think about Germany, is not corrupt. And so the EEC tried to bring Greece and Germany together. That didn't work. There was no unity there. The modularity was actually useful. And the fact that Greece was so destabilized, and Italy, also very corrupt, and Spain, also very corrupt, was very shaky, just about brought the whole thing down. the argument is the modularity would have been better conserved. Well, who knows, right? Because modularity is useful and so is integration. But full integration seems to be a mistake, and so does full modularity. How do you get that right? We don't know. That's why we're arguing about it. And right now there's a backlash. We're pulling away from the integration. And you can see why too, because in 2008 when the American economy collapsed, the world economy just about collapsed. That seems like a bad idea. You know, you might want some separateness so that if one system malfunctions and goes down, the whole bloody thing doesn't go into flames. And so we don't know how to manage that. It's a really, really complicated problem. So anyways, okay, so how does the brain work? Well, the left, roughly speaking, in right-handed males, and the reason that I'm concentrating on right-handed males is because they're simpler in their neurological structure. Women have a more complicated neurological structure, and left-handed people tend to have a more complicated neurological structure. So we'll just say that we'll just go with the standard model to begin with, and you can assume that the same systems are there in every person, but they're not laid out on the hemispheric structure quite as neatly, but they're still there. So it's sort of like these are tendencies. So for example, if you're so there's a tendency for the right hemisphere to specialize for what's relatively unknown, and the left hemisphere to specialize for what's relatively mastered. And you could think about it this way too. Left, right. It's something like that, okay? So large-scale, low-resolution abstractions tend to be the province of the right. High-resolution, detailed knowledge structures tend to be the province of the left. The left is linguistic. That's where the detailed structures manifest themselves in articulation. But the fundamental difference between the left and right isn't language versus non-language. The fundamental distinction is relatively explored and mastered versus relatively unexplored and not mastered. And that's both in terms of structure. The right hemisphere has a less granular structure. It's less differentiated. It's also responsible mostly for negative emotion, especially in the prefrontal part. And the reason for that is, well, how do you encounter what's absolutely unknown? Imagination and emotion, right? I told you that little experiment that you could do if you're alone in a house and you hear a strange noise at night in a room. Just turn off the lights and put your hand in the room. It's like your brain will just flash off monsters like mad. You know, you'll be nervous because what's in that room? Something to make you nervous. That's a very low resolution category, right? It's like, it's some indeterminate manifestation of the category of things that might hurt you. Very low resolution, but a very smart category. It's like, don't put your hand in there. You put your hand in there and you watch your imagination. It's like monsters. It'll generate monsters like mad. And that's what the right hemisphere is doing. It's saying, what's in there is an exemplar of the category of things that are dangerous. Here's a bunch of images of those things. And that thing in there is going to partake of that essence. And that's a very low resolution hypothesis. That's kind of what horror movies do with people. You know, they sort of lead them through that initial process. And so that's what the right hemisphere seems to me to be dominated by subcortical processes. Whereas the left hemisphere is reversed. The cortex has more or less got dominion. And so the right hemisphere, well, we'll walk through this neurologically, but the right hemisphere responds rapidly to what's unknown, and that's subcorticals. The hippocampus is doing an awful lot of that, noting a mismatch. And then it's using the right hemisphere to abstractly represent what the possibility space is in relationship to unexpected things. And then the right hemisphere is tracking that continually, what those unexpected things are, and coming up with models of what you haven't yet mastered. And that's kept separate from the left hemisphere, which already has functional models. And you don't want to blast the left hemisphere continually with anomalous information because you blow out its structure and then you don't know what to do. So the right hemisphere generates new models in some sense out of nothing, and then when the time is right, taps information into the left hemisphere slowly so that it doesn't disrupt its function too much. And a lot of that seems to happen when you're dreaming, by the way. It happens at night. So, and what happens with the dreams, you think about how dreams work, is you might think of dreams as part of that process where ideas come to be. So they're low resolution to begin with, mostly imagistic, really highly emotional, and incoherent. Less coherent. Why? You can't be coherent unless you know what to do. A, B, C, D, E, F. If that's working, you got coherence. But if you're dealing with something you don't know, you have to muck about with your category structures. And that's what dreams do. And you know, when you're interpreting a dream, one of the things you watch for is the dream presents this and then this. That's called metonymy, by the way, from a literary perspective. And what that implies is this is related to this in some way. Why else would they be co-activated? You know, people say, well, dreams are random. That's the stupidest theory I've ever heard. Like, white noise is random. Dreams are not random. They're hard to understand, but they're anything but random. They're more random than real life. Well, that's because what you don't understand is really random, and you're organized, and there has to be an intermediary that's sort of quasi-random between them, or you never get from one to the other. And dreams and fantasies, myths, all of that is part of that process that stretches you out beyond what you know into the absolute unknown. And so, and your hemispheres are differentially specialized for that. So, roughly speaking, right hemisphere, operation in unexplored territory. That's a really good way of thinking about it. You need a system that tells you what to do when you don't know what to do. A huge part of the subcortical structures are doing that too. Unknown, freeze, then what? Imagine, right? Freeze, emotion, imagine. Then explore, then differentiate, then master. That's the process. That's the process of learning. And what you're doing is you're transforming low resolution representations of what's frightening into high resolution representations that enable you to master it, to take the world apart and to make ingenious things out of it. So there's this very cool part of the Mesopotamian creation myth. So the major hero, whose name is Marduk, confronts the dragon of chaos, Tiamat, who's feminine, and he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world out of her pieces. And one of his names, he had 50, 60 names, and I think those were amalgams of tribal gods. And one of the names was, he who makes ingenious things out of the conflict with Tiamat. It's absolutely perfect. That's exactly what human beings do, right? We confront that terrible predatory potential that lies outside our domain of experience, and we make ingenious things out of it. And then we talk about how we did it, and then we model how we did it. And that's the basis of our ethics and our morality. And the way that ties into, think about, one of the things we talked about was that the mythological hero was a representation not of the being that was at the top of the dominance hierarchy, but of the being that was at the top of the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. Okay, so here's a cool equation. The hero who goes out into the unknown to make contact with the dragon and to bring back the treasure is the same thing that wins the battle across sets of dominance hierarchies. And that's how the two things come together, right? It's so brilliant. It's so absolutely brilliant. And so it's the mythological hero. The mythological hero is the representation of what's, again, not at the top of one dominance hierarchy, but at the top of all of them. That's the eye that's above the pyramid. Why the eye? Because it pays attention. And that's what you do. Like, none of this is not fiction. It's meta-truth. It's the right way to think about it. Look, let's say you're socially anxious. Okay, so what happens when you're socially anxious? You go to a party, your heart's beating. Why? The party is a monster. Why? Because it's judging you. And it's judging you, it's putting you low down the dominance hierarchy, because that's what a negative judgment is. And that interferes with your sexual success. And that means that you're being harshly evaluated by nature itself. Right? So you are confronting the dragon of chaos when you go into the social situation. And so what do? You're like this, right? You hunch over, and that's low dominance. I'm no threat. It's like, well, that's not going to get you very far. You know, but that's a logical thing to do in the face of a tyrant. So I'm no threat. You know, you look at the king and you're dead. I'm no threat. I'm hunched over. And then what's happening internally? What are people thinking about me? What are people thinking about me? Am I looking stupid? Am I looking foolish? Geez, I'm awkward. I hate being here. Man, I'm sweating too much. It's all internalized, right? It's all self-focused. The eye isn't working. What do you tell people? Don't stop thinking about yourself, because you can't. It's like, don't think of a white elephant. White elephant, white elephant, white elephant. You can't tell someone to stop thinking about something because they get caught in a loop. What you do with socially anxious people is you say, look at other people. Look at them. right? Why? Because if you look at them, you can tell what they're thinking.